All right. So just being mindful of the time, it's about 2:31. I want to sort of get us started with introductions and everything. So welcome everyone to Asian American Womanhood and Resilience, provided by the PA Care Partnership Grant in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, also known as OMSAS. Today's moderators are part of the PA Care Partnership. We have Kelsey Leonard, who is our Cultural and Linguistic Competency person. She is the moderator. She will be moderating today. We have Nancy Massey will be monitoring the chat, and then you have myself, and I will be mostly doing tech today. So you will hear Nancy next, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Jamal. Welcome to everybody. I just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items with you. Just to remind everyone that we have Q&A. If you run your mouse along the bottom of the screen, you'll see Q&A. And we would ask you all to place your questions in Q&A. And during the time of the presentation, if you'll place them in Q&A, when the presentation is completed, Kelsey will walk us through answering the questions, hopefully all of them. And I'll be in chat and moderating chat. And if you're having any other issues, and I'm here if you need help with something. But one of the things I'd like to talk about with the chat is we have found in the past several webinars that people who are attending the chat have provided us with some very exciting resources. So if you have any resources related to what we're talking about today that you'd like to share, please put them in the chat and I'll make sure that everyone sees that. We have a special guest with us today who's doing an illustration. You'll see that on the screen. I'll let Kelsey tell you more. And I would say we are also very excited to have Esther and Noel with us today. They've been with us before, Esther several times, and we have learned so much from them and are so grateful for their time and what they have taught us. And about the Asian cultures, and I want to ensure that I say this, it's not one culture, it's many cultures. And we're very excited to hear the conversation today about Asian womanhood. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to introduce. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy and Jamal, so much for organizing today's session, bringing us all together for this beautiful conversation. As the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, it's also my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our guest today, but to also be able to highlight that July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And so today's session is also about being able to amplify those voices that often go unheard across our variety of systems for mental and behavioral health care. So we hope that today's conversation, and rather not hope, but know that today's conversation will inspire you to continue to advance more equity and inclusivity and justice across systems of care. So with that, as was mentioned earlier, we have the distinct pleasure as well of having a unique aspect to today's webinar. It's something that we've implemented in past years, and we feel really fortunate to be able to bring back our partner from Ink Factory throughout the year to be able to share in these webinar sessions with us. And so we have a wonderful illustrator, Kinshasa England, joining us today, who will be live sketchnoting the conversation that we have today. And so you'll see their screen shared with us at key moments during the conversation, directly after the presentation, and then directly after the Q&A. So if you are eager to engage and you share your correspondence and thoughts through the Q&A, you'll be captured in this live art, really, of our capturing our conversation and the memories that we'll share together today. So that is one unique feature of today. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce our guest presenters. So to start, we have Dr. Esther Hio-Tong Castillo, who is a scholar, educator, and mental health and social justice advocate with expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion matters. She has nearly 2 decades of working experience in education as a teacher, counselor, community advocate, and faculty in various educational settings, including early childhood education, youth programs, adult education, and higher education. She is a proud biracial queer woman, a first-generation college student, and a 1.5-generation immigrant. Her identity and life story have strengthened her dedication to improving mental wellness and equities for Asian immigrant communities. Moreover, Dr. Castillo has an MA in Humanities and Social Thoughts from NYU and a PhD in Sociology from Temple University. She is the founder and program director of the Chinese Immigrant Families Wellness Initiative at the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. At SIFWI, maybe I got the acronym wrong, but the Chinese Immigrant Families Wellness Initiative, she implements and organizes all programming and offers wellness workshops to Asian immigrant parents and their children. So thank you so much to Dr. Esther Hio-Tong Castillo for joining us today. And then we also have our other co-presenter, Noel Ramirez. Dr. Noel Ramirez is the son of 2 beautifully resilient Filipino immigrants. He grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey. He is a clinical social worker dedicated to creating opportunities for folks and communities to find a home within themselves. Dr. Ramirez is the director and owner of Mango Tree Counseling and Consulting, a group practice and mental health resource center for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, API folks in Pennsylvania. Outside of Mango Tree, Dr. Ramirez is involved in varying community health and empowerment initiatives, specifically in working as a behavioral health consultant at a local federally qualified health center, teaching graduate social work practice on intersectionality and healing-centered practices at Columbia University and Westchester University, and also social empowerment programming with Philadelphia Asian and Queer. He received his doctorate in behavioral health from Arizona State University, a graduate degree in public health from Drexel University, and his MSW, Master's in Social Work, from the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, I want to turn it over to our distinguished presenters, Dr. Hio-Tong Castillo and Dr. Ramirez. Please take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm gonna start. So thank you everyone for coming and joining us, and thank you for Kelsey for the introduction. So today we're gonna talk about Asian American womanhood and resilience. Next slide, please. So Noel, you want to share our hopes for today?
Yeah, so hi everyone. We're so excited to be here. And again, one of the reasons this came up was me and Esther love this film. We were talking about it in our social media accounts, and the film Turning Red really highlighted a lot of the work that Esther and I are doing in the community around identity, around gender, around culture. And so hopes for today, and again, this is an interactive, open discussion. So we do hope that folks do take advantage of the Q&A component and share their thoughts, but we hope to really open up a floor and talking about gender identity and culture. Again, talking about mental wellness, this film, as well as the work that we're doing. And I was just looking at the chat and seeing what people are doing, and a lot of folks here are stewards of mental wellness. So we hope to really dive deep into that. Also talking about the concepts and themes related to AAPI identity, diaspora. This film is deeply rooted in talking about family systems and the different types of families that are out there. And finally, a hot topic that has been coming up a lot, but is something that is really important to talk through, especially in the city of Philadelphia, is broad concepts around intergenerational trauma and resilience. Next slide. And I think we already did our bios, but if there's anything, maybe a shameless plug, I'll share from Mango Tree Counseling and Consulting. If anyone's interested in learning about Asian American love, conflict, and communication, one of my associate therapists is doing a seminar tonight at 8 o'clock, Debbie Deep, on that. So it's completely free. You can check out our website, mangotreecc.com, if you're interested. And Esther, do you have any shout outs that you want to do with what your program is doing?
Thank you, Noel. And Kelsey pronounced it right. We call it SIFWE among folks who are affiliates with us. It was founded 2 years ago. We do a lot of programming with youth and also adults, mostly people who are in immigrant families, families with parents who's are monolingual, who don't speak English that well. So we are more specifically cater to the Chinese immigrants families. Thanks. Next slide, please. Noel, you want to start first,
Sure.
and then I'll add on. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So this question, why now? And why this talk? And I'm kind of curious in the chat, if folks are open to it, if you can just share what was it about this particular webinar that attracted you? Like why, maybe it was you love this movie so much, maybe the content was something, but just taking an inventory of who's in the room and what's coming up. What was it that attracted you to this? And one of the things that came up for us as the organizers were really at an important time in not only US history, but world history. Lots of different content has come up and issues that have always been here. But our hope really in having this conversation was to create a community space for folks to talk about what's been going on for folks. We're talking a lot about Roe versus Wade and human rights, body autonomy. We've also seen in the last couple of years a significant increase in documented Asian hate moments. I mean, we've been seeing this throughout history, but now there's more eyes on it. We're also in really interesting crossroads in different state laws around sexuality and how sexuality is being written and talked about, specifically with the the Don't Say Gay bill. There's more language around trauma in the last 15 years. And so the discussion around intergenerational trauma, why we are who we are, where we've come from. There's also other issues that surround womanhood in the US, specifically period poverty and other elements that have come up around women's bodies, and also immigration. A big part of this film is it's rooted in the diaspora in Canada, and immigration, and the dynamics of immigration are huge modern topics. So we're hoping to really center a dialogue on that. And this film really checked a lot of those boxes, but also spoke to different pieces of that. Esther, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Noel. And I was reading some of the response in the chat, and I just want to say that for me personally, I think the Atlanta shooting last year really opened up the floodgates for me personally, and then ever since then, I just felt like we never, as an Asian woman, like, and when I say we, I'm referring to Asian women, that we never get a chance to rest, because it's just like assault after assault after assault. It's just like it's been going on. So I really want to create a space, and thank you to my co-organizer Noel to also make that space, to talk about what it means to be sitting at the intersection of Asian and also women at this time in history. And for those who are Asian identifying, welcome, and I hope that you can find experiences and stories and narratives that validate your experience. If you're not an Asian or not an Asian woman, we're here to share more about this. I think similar to what Noel said, like, this is important because of what's going on in politics, and really creating a space to talk more about it is also a way of healing for me, and hopefully for the community.
And thank you all so much for sharing the chat. Like these messages are really profound. I'm like really moved by some of the disclosures here and vulnerability. So again, I just wanted to say thank you for showing up.
Next slide, please. So I want to give us some context about some violence against AAPI. So trigger warning if you don't feel like you have the capacity, feel free to walk out. It's just one slide and then we'll move on. And just more context, especially for those who are not directly impacted by violence. So Asian violence against AAPI women are not new, just like what Noel said. It is something that's being paid more attention to because more eyes are on it, and then more violence are being documented, you know, on like especially the more interpersonal day-to-day incidents, but also racism and violence is also structural against AAPI women. So I'll start with the legal, and even before, you might have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and if not, it was enacted in 1886. We are the only ethnic group. I'm personally Chinese, so when I say we, I'm just talking about myself too. Chinese is the only group that was targeted as a specific ethnic group to bar immigration. But even before then, there was the Page Law in 1875, in which the importation of Asian women specifically were banned, and in the law, Asian women were described as coming here for quote unquote immoral purposes, and there is the Alien Land Law that ban immigrants to own land. There's also the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. So there are laws that are enacted and institutionalized racism specifically geared towards AAPI and AAPI women. But also culturally, there are ongoing assault and violence that portrays Asian women as hypersexualized and objectified, fetishized as sexual objects for men, and specifically white men. And you have the Madame Butterfly, that was an opera that was written in early 20th century, and then they did a movie in 1954. You have American GIs and more and more. And this is just a short list. But then if you think about all these cultural moments where Asian women are often being seen as silenced, oppressed, submissive, and also hypersexualized at the same time, you can find a lot of examples. And these kind of cultural representation and portrayals also reflect what's going on in history. Throughout history, there are a lot of colonization in most parts of Asia that is largely left out in any of the history textbooks. So you have we have the colonization of the Philippines, and during the World Wars, most part of China was being colonized, and also most of Southeast Asia was colonized at some point in history. World Wars, we have the Southeast Asian wars that were inflicted mostly by the U.S. in the 1970s to 80s. So if we dig deep into history, there is a connection between the portrayal of Asian women as hypersexualized objects and also these wars, right? So for example, in the World Wars, Korean women, there were the comfort women, sex slaves that were highly common during wars, and these kind of sexual violence is still being imposed on Asian women, sex trafficking, and next slide, please. Just want to give a quick statistic. So if we look at the global sex trade and modern slavery, Asia and the Pacific, occupy the largest proportion of all global estimate compared to other regions at 62%. And forced labors and forced marriage are still highly common in Asia. So these are just numbers, some numbers. Next slide, please. And if you look at locally, nationally within the U.S., if you look at the anti-Asian hate that become more and more common for the last couple and 3 years, we see that Asian women, more specifically, is the most likely victim across all, like across people who have other genders, or actually younger Asian women are most likely to be the victims across all age groups and gender identities. So Asian female is at 53%. So we are still most likely to be victimized, but at the same time being portrayed as hypersexualized in the mass media and not having a voice at the same time. So this just give a brief context. I could go on and on, but I just want to show that this is not new. This has been ongoing ever since the first Asian person arrived in the United States. Next slide, and I'll hand it to Noel.
Right. Yeah. So we are. Let me just make sure I have my notes here. Yeah, so one of the major elements that I came up with this, and I saw that there was a number of clinicians here, so I'm so excited for us to even talk more about this clinically, is this notion of intergenerational trauma. I'm kind of curious again, I want to put this to the audience. When you hear intergenerational trauma, what comes to mind? This film really, it's a major theme in this particular film. And again, just broadly defining intergenerational trauma, there's this really beautiful graphic from an Instagram content creator that looks at these critical incidences and moments of intergenerational trauma, war, violence, what we look at colonization, partition in South Asia, slavery, World War II, and how generationally that level of trauma significantly impacts not just one generation, but is constantly passed on through the rest. And so this film really explores what that generational trauma is through the sort of use of imagery like pandas and aggression. But in our here and now, what we see, and you can see in this graphic, is PTSD in one generation can result to alcoholism in another, can result to sexual acting out behavior and emotional repression. And what that might look like is one set of family members are really traumatized, hypervigilance, affect dysregulation, 0 to 100, produces a child that is hyperstimulated by these trauma symptoms, turns to alcohol to soothe, which then turns to maybe the next generation where there might be some violence in the family, right? So we can see how one moment can create another moment, and there's a ripple effect in intergenerational trauma. I have a clip that I will show folks from, oops, this will stop the other person's. Okay, yes, I do want to continue. And I wanted to show a quick clip. There's some great work with folks, the Indigenous community in Australia, that does a lot of explanation discussion around intergenerational trauma. So I'm going to navigate sharing a screen with the community here, because I always have this anxiety that I'm going to share like my retirement plan by accident with everybody, or my bank account. No one wants to see. All right, so this is a really great clip on intergenerational trauma. They're doing some really great work, and it talks about the sort of impact of intergenerational trauma across different generations.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were, and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then, our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au.
So, intergenerational trauma, another way I like to describe it is it's moments inside moments inside moments. And so what we're talking about today, this idea of today, the current violence of towards Asian Americans, the language that is often what I'll hear with some of my patients is this phrase, go home, right? Like, get out of here, you don't belong, which is, as Esther was talking about, an enactment of history, right? Where there was literally laws that said you really don't belong here. And so when we look at generational trauma, important language to keep in mind is this word enactments, right? Enactments are moments inside moments inside moments. In Red Panda, Turning Red, there were moments inside moments inside moments around what the red panda represented, as well as relationships, how our relationships with people are moments inside different moments inside different moments. On the other side of generational trauma is this concept of resilience. And I found this quote or this description of resilience really moving. Resilience is a capacity to persist, to adopt, or transform in the face of change in a way that maintains the basic identity of the system. And since we're looking at ecological resilience, we are invested in really enabling long-term human survival and well-being as part of a biosphere. So it's quite closely linked to sustainability. I think about people that I've worked with, my own family, and folks, maybe you can think a little bit about what does resilience mean for you, especially if you come from people in the diaspora, and diaspora means people living outside of their homeland. What does that resilience look like? I think of families who have undergone so much adversity and trauma through colonization, through war, and yet still have the ability to hold each other, to laugh, to share food, to survive. So resilience, as well as intergenerational trauma, are two major components. We're going to talk a little bit about both and how this film creates different avenues to sort of ponder about that. And I want to check in with Esther to bring up some more points.
Thanks, Noel, and thank you for sharing that video. And I also want to bring up this idea of the different ways in which different groups of color interact with the system of white supremacy, right? So usually when we think about white supremacy, when we think about racism, we think about black and white. But I also want to bring into the conversation of systemic racism, into bring in Asians and also indigenous people into that conversation, right? So there is this article that calls the 3 pillars of white supremacy. So anti-blackness is one of them, right? And then the system of enactment is through slavery, and also like the new Jim Crow, and the way that black people are still being oppressed in so many systemic ways, including the criminal justice system, housing, and all these different revenues, right? And when you think about the indigenous indigenous experience, is through erasure, right? This stolen generation, right? So there is this rhetoric about how Native people don't exist, when in fact that they are still among us, right? And so you've got the dehumanization of black folks, and you got the erasure of indigenous people. And for Asians specifically, the way we engage and the way that our history has been intertwined with colonization is particularly through this concept of Orientalism, that Asian folks are constantly being cast as foreign, being cast as from the other land, that's being cast as the enemy of the state. And I saw that there was a comment made by one of you in the chat about how China is always or often being framed as the enemy of the United States, right? So it is through these 3 pillars of white supremacy that racism continues to sustain itself, and it is through the recognition of how we can dismantle white supremacy through our resilience, and that we can move forward together. Thank you.
I love that, we're one of the healing elements of intergenerational trauma and trauma in general is what we're doing today, which is developing language, right? When we have more language to talk about the pain, Esther is describing like the components of narratives of racism and pain and intergenerational trauma in the US, it helps us formulate sort of the pain that folks are going through. Exactly this idea of Orientalism, citizenship. A lot of people have been talking about citizenship and this idea of belonging, and how that resonates for people in the diaspora. What it means to be Asian American sometimes for me is this idea of where is home, right? And it doesn't help when someone's like, go home, and I'm like, New Jersey's just right over there, and then I'm in a New Jersey or something like that. So there's like a lot of meta narratives when we look at trauma, and part of trauma recovery and resilience is cultivating more language and retelling a new story. So thank you for bringing that up. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of my favorite conversations, and a big part of this, there's folks here who are interested in learning about Asian American identity. There's folks here who really love the movie. That's me and Esther and some other folks here. And there's folks here who really felt moved by the content of AAPI identity in general, wanted to explore about this. So I want to talk a little bit about family systems briefly, because this was a huge element. You know, the main character, May, is struggling with both individualist and collectivist frameworks of how to exist. And this is a common struggle for people who grow up in a diaspora. You know, you come to a place outside of your homeland, and there's a whole different narrative of how to engage. And usually, and there's multiple frameworks, but here's one: individualist and collectivist frameworks. I believe this film was in Canada, I think Toronto to be exact. I think it's this family is in Toronto. And so what we see are two different frameworks, individualist and collectivist. And I want to say that this really exists in a continuum. Right? No one is just purely one or the other. People are constantly, you know, with global identities, global economies, people are navigating between the two. But when we see sort of individualist perspectives typically found in the West, people talk a lot about, you know, express yourself, be who you are. Children learn to think in terms of I feel, I want, I need. Individual ownership, there's this language around autonomy, this idea of self-actualization by every individual is the ultimate goal, and self-actualization being me and who I am. Occupation mobility is higher. People talk a lot about, again, just individual identity, pride, and shame. And when we look at collectivist cultures, we see more interdependence on a unit. We think of we, right? We look at relationships that are a little bit more formalized. I remember growing up hearing, my mom's my best friend. And I was like, really? Like, my mom is like the warden of my house. I don't want to be friends with the warden, right? There's different elements of how people connect and how things are described. Self-actualization is not as prioritized as harmony, right? This idea of continuing harmony, keeping the peace. Relationships prevail over tasks. And we also see when it comes to collectivist cultures, I think the binary of individualist cultures is shame and pride. In collectivist cultures, I often see dishonor or disgrace and honor, feeling indebted, contributing to. And again, there's a continuum. This is a really like a theory-driven piece, but I want to show a quick clip that will demonstrate the tensions of individualist and collectivist dynamics. And of course, what that means is a clip from really bad reality TV that's problematic, so forgive me. There is a TV show called 90 Day Fiance. Has anyone heard of that film? 90 Day Fiance. It's super problematic. I show this clip to describe the tensions that we see in collectivist and individual structures. And again, I just want to preface by saying this show is so problem ridden, but this clip, I think you can see the tensions in that. And so here we go, folks. Trigger warning. There is a pig, a cooked pig that is being prepared for the family.
A little celebration for you, love. It's rose lechon.
Lechon, it's expensive, but my family wants Larry's happy and they want to bonding with Larry. The last time we have lechon, I think when I was a kid.
I see this pig just sitting there, and I'm like, oh no, man. I'm not an adventurous eater, and I'm just like so worried because I'll have diarrhea problems.
Larry,
Oh,
you're the first to taste it. You taste.
I don't know what to do at this point because I know I don't want to eat this pig.
You eat. You eat.
I just, can everybody else just eat?
Yeah, you first, then they eat. You first.
We cook for you.
You try it.
Yeah.
Ang paglilitsyon, inaabot ng 5 oras.
Dito sa amin, dito sa Pilipinas, kapag may bisita, hindi nagustuhan yung inihanda namin. Yung iba siguro maiinis. Partito namin, suna. Kasi kami mga sunahaan. Bagam ka no?
What's the matter? Why you that face? Jenny is just so pissed off right now. I can see it in her face, and I'm just like, I have no idea what's going on at this point. Well, what's the matter with you? What's the matter?
You're old, you know.
What?
You're old.
What's the matter? I'm old?
You acting like a kid.
Why?
You don't have respect.
Gotta love those family dinners, right, folks? Yeah, so when what we see again with the individuals and collectivist structures again is a person's will and idea is thinking about themselves. And again, you know, I don't want to say negative or positive. This is a really slanted perspective, but you could see the social pressures in the family. Folks, there's a lot of rules and regulations around harmony, and both offer some important components, right? Like collectivist cultures, wearing a mask is super important, right? Like take care of the community. Individualist perspective, self-respect, take care of yourself, advocacy, both offer important elements. So I don't want to say one versus the other, but in the intersection of AAPI identity, especially in the diaspora, these tensions are what people struggle with the most, is how do we integrate? How do we find ways through the tension? And again, I'm finding myself really hungry from seeing that lechon. So I'm going to pass the mic off to Esther to share some points about collectivism versus individualist perspective.
Thanks, Noel. I'm Chinese, and we also have a similar dish in Cantonese culture. We call siuju, and we only bring it out when it's like big events, like festivals, you know. And the clip also make me think about how in collectivist culture we often center on gratitude with our relationship with food, right? Versus in America, food is often being talked about using language like calories, which is also and health, which is usually being associated with guilt and shame, right? There is a much stronger focus on gratitude and bringing harmony and people together in a more collectivistic culture. Next slide.
I threw this in here about 20 minutes ago. So I wanted to make sure that I discuss this element of diaspora. And I think this is also, I want to introduce this element because you know, when we talk about the US and specifically the US, there's a very particular way people are talking, that people talk about race and identity. But often, again, it's one of the pieces around Asia, the Asian diaspora is citizenship is a huge element of different ways. Where people land, different cultural tensions that exist before even coming to the US to here. You can see diaspora in South Asian diaspora, specifically in the West Indies and South America. We can look at like the Chinese diaspora in parts of Southeast Asia. So there's already and has already been thousands and thousands of years of integration. Like this whole like US 300 years ago melting pot, like that's been already done in Asia. You know, I just found out that I was an eighth Chinese. I didn't know this. One of my students in a university that I reached out to was my 23andMe relative, and she was an adoptee and wanted to know about her Chinese heritage. And I was like, I didn't know I was Chinese, but we're related. And as you can see in this particular map, there is a huge Chinese diaspora in the Philippines. And so this is a huge context that I think often gets overlooked in race identity in the US, is that there's already been integration in diaspora. Citizenship is a real component in different cultures that people might write off as just homogenous. Questions around citizenship, class, and status are other elements that people kind of come through. And so this word diaspora keeps on coming up. And it's actually Greek for the word scattering, meaning people going to places outside of their homeland and living and creating lives and creating new homes. And the complicated dynamic of that is critical. And so I wanted to make sure that that was included in the dynamic of our conversation, and that we build that language, because Turning Red really deals a lot with the diaspora. Next slide. I think that's it. Oh, this is, I'll pass the mic off to Esther.
And just now, Noel talked about collectivist culture, and in Turning Red, we're looking at a Chinese family, and in Chinese culture, there's this strong focus on filial piety. You see a Chinese character at the background on a painting. It literally says filial piety. So it's just the idea that we have a sense of responsibility to our parents, that we should honor them and make them feel proud, and those kind of narratives often also get integrated with the racial stereotype that a lot of Asians face, which is model minority, and that translates into like the kind of pressure to succeed, right, and the responsibility that you have for your family, which is very prevalent in immigrant families, but it's also being hijacked, right, by U.S. politicians or the mainstream to describe Asian Americans as a monolith, and don't really provide that context of why we feel that sense of pressure to succeed, right? And just to kind of flatten it and make it very one-dimensional, that Asians are just smart, you know, and in turns it justify a lot of our oppression, or in real life it causes a lot of anxiety and depression at least in the community that I serve. I see a lot of that, right? I have talked to youth who told me that when they get a good SAT score, they would be made fun of by their teachers, saying that, of course you're Asian. So a lot of the youth that I encounter, they don't feel like they can own their success. Thank you, Noel, for saving the day. And I just want to point that out just now when we also talked about this contrast between honoring oneself and honoring the family. I think it keeps on showing up about like how as a person being an immigrant, you know, being part of the diaspora, we often feel that push and pull, right, of like honoring yourself and honoring your culture and your communities and your family. Noel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, you know, a lot of cultures have different words for this. You know what I mean? I know in our South Asian listening circle, one of the terms that comes up, or the saying that people will discuss, is what will people say? Like this fear of like bringing dishonor to your family. I can even say in my culture, there's a phrase called utang ng loob, which is the debt of the inner self. And so you're constantly charged in my family to pay back this debt of life. And so your life should be a series of payments, if you will, to pay back the debt. I've joked once with a client. I was like, how many Coach bags will it cost to square my bill from being born? That's a lot of Coach bags for my mom. And so, yeah, I definitely see this piece of filial piety. I'm actually going to do my share screen, Esther, because I think mine, I can play your clip, play some of the clips here. So this is a really great clip. And again, some elements we're gonna talk a little bit about. Again, when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about enactments. Part of trauma is, and how some folks cope with trauma is they swallow it or try to suppress it and contain it. And here's a really interesting clip that really embodies this in Turning Red. Oh, actually, let me give some context here. So if you haven't watched the film, which we encourage you to do, spoiler alert, there is this what we call a generational curse, which is the language that's used in this film to talk about intergenerational trauma. It's framed under this curse. And this curse is that the women of the family turn into red pandas, these gigantic red pandas, when they're when they are stimulated, when they're very stressed out. It was a survival mechanism for their ancestors to defend their village. But when wartime has died down and they didn't need these panda warriors, it became seen as a burden, right? You became this gigantic panda. And so there's this ritual to contain the panda into a pendant, which is why there's this beautiful jade bracelet that I'm like thinking about buying maybe later. That is the symbolism here, is that the relatives have contained their red pandas in these pendants. And again, symbolic to the notion of disavowal. Like, how do we disavow parts of us? Some people will talk about the word compartmentalize parts of themselves into a box. And this is an example of that. So I'm going to so lots of juicy stuff here. We're seeing so let me and also just really emotional stuff, right? So what we're seeing again when we talk about intergenerational moments inside moments inside moments, mother struggles with other mothers' expectations, so anxiety, filial piety, these kind of messages throughout the generations. And you can see this kind of magical place that folks come to is the psyche, right? And one of the elements, and if folks are ever interested in talking more about this, you can check out mangotreecc.com if you're looking to do some intergenerational trauma therapy work, is this language around the inner child, where the injury existed. There's also other themes of the carrying your trauma, these jade pendants, this idea of the trauma is with you, it's part of you, you're carrying with it. How you carry it is also another element. And as we were talking earlier about suppression, what we saw in that particular moment is what we would describe as corrective experiences, right? Or these like sort of subconscious wishes of being held. The mother was seeking sort of this holding with mother. I want to know from the crowd and also from my colleague Esther, what other things came up for you when you were watching this clip?
It was highly emotional for me. I think what really came up to me is like healing your inner child. There's a lot of this talk and in our community, I think in the Asian mental health community, about healing inner child and being and understanding how like these kind of expectations are being passed down, and those kind of like really strict kind of parenting and the expectation and anticipation for oneself to be perfect is being passed down from one generation to another. I also think that there is something very specific to being a woman and being an Asian woman, in that scene of that amulet, of that pendant, right? That we need to suppress whatever that looks ugly and turn it into something that looks beautiful, and so we can be perfect. And there is this pressure, I think, especially for Asian women in the family, to represent your family in a way that looks good, right? And failure to do that would be bringing dishonor to your family. So there's so much of that pressure, and also being upheld by other women in the family, right? So you see the absence of men in that scene, and then that pressure mostly come from a mother to a daughter to the granddaughter. So it's very much centered on womanhood.
Another element I saw too that was really, I think, profound and also intense is this idea of, you know, the big panda falls down, and in order to heal some of the things, the whole community needed to be involved, and not just the red pandas who did a lot of the heavy lifting. They were helping to move, but part of the curative factors of intergenerational trauma, or how to cure and hold it, is getting the community, multi generations. We saw sort of the O-Town Fort Town reference, and anyone who grew up in the early 2000s and late 90s could appreciate the boy band situation. The friends of May being a part of that, the father, and that I think one of the messages as we're doing here is um, resolving and creating resilience and healing from intergenerational trauma really involves the community, not just one person, but everyone. Um, and I'm seeing some folks on the chat saying the importance of family pathology by healing the intergenerational traumas. Exactly. When mom was crying because she felt like she wasn't good enough for her, generalized to not being good enough, anyone that is really accurate representation of how pressure can turn into feeling like a failure. And I want to say, you know, in some of the AAPI identity struggles, especially when it comes to citizenship, there is often, or anyone who has been subjugated, anyone who has found themselves in the margins of hegemonic messages, this struggle of too much or not enough is often a big struggle for a lot of folks. When her mother says she never felt she was, very awakening, the child was able to reassure her mother's inner strength. Yeah, there was something in that moment of speaking to her younger self that, and sometimes when we're looking at trauma or intergenerational trauma, we're talking about arrested development, right? The idea that people are trapped at the age that folks have been wounded. And sometimes in doing trauma work, we encourage folks to really think about not only who that inner child is, but what do they need to hear, say, and how do we take care of that inner child at that age? Somebody said they saw themselves with and my mom with May and her mom, this whole movie. Yeah, it's really just illuminating relationship, how it takes a community to heal. Yes, definitely a scene that can be connected to. Even as an adult, I feel like it's a general strive to want to be good enough for your parents and to make them proud whenever one cannot live to emotional becomes emotional. And it does take a community to her trying. And I just want to put that out there for folks who are stewards of healthcare and human relationships. The importance of making sure there is community related work in your healing vehicle, because this work, especially here in Philadelphia, really it takes a whole village to facilitate this kind of healing. So yeah, we can go on to the next slide. Oh, and we're going to share my screen. Should I share this, or Esther, do you want to take this one?
I think you have to share it, because I think the other PowerPoint is not linking up. But I can talk a little bit about this scene. So this scene is directly followed by the previous scene, and in which here we see that this, to me, my understanding is that May decided to keep her panda instead of getting rid of it. So then she learns how to accept her red panda inside her. So there is a lot of talk about breaking the cycle. I remember someone also in the chat mentioned Encanto, which is another Pixar movie that addresses intergenerational trauma, mostly from a Latinx lens. Yeah, if you can hit play, we can talk more about that.
That was so awesome, Noel and Esther. Just wanted to share some things that were coming in through the chat. A lot of folks are going to be watching the film after today's session. And a few other folks have also noted that it's really important to not only watch the film, but the making of the film, which highlights the director and I believe maybe also producer of the movie, Domi Shi, and sort of the predominantly female crew. So thanks to the folks in the chat who have been sharing that with us. Also, just a quick time check for our presenters. If we want to sort of navigate over to the Q&A, we'll leave some time for your closing thoughts and then migrate that way. And for audience members, please be sure to start to share your Q&A thoughts as our presenters share their closing thoughts.
So just quickly jumping in there really quickly in what we were even just watching in this particular clip. When we talk about insights and recovery and resilience that the film had mentioned, when we think about trauma recovery as a whole, there's a couple of key concepts and interventions and programming clinically, conversations around meaning making, turning towards creating safety and affect regulation, loss and future, which is what we were seeing here in this particular clip. Utilizing a critical consciousness to look at the nature, the history, and the context of where the pain started and how it came up. Integration, again, what May was doing was integrating her red panda, making it part of the family business, literally and figuratively speaking. In this film, there's also lots of self-soothing. She starts combing her face to sort of soothe her stress. Communities of support, shame reduction. There was a lot of secrecy around the red panda, which can also be symbolic to other things around womanhood. And there's a lot of folks who were experiencing the red panda. And so May's character really finds wholeness in being able to talk about it out loud, even wearing parts of her panda out to karaoke, which I thought was kind of cool. Radical acceptance, this idea of accepting the panda and honoring context. Any thoughts that you have, Esther? Again, I just wanted to throw those pieces in there, but were there any conversations or insights that you'd seen with this clip and other clips of Red Panda?
Yeah, I just feel so proud of Mei Mei as a character and for like embracing the red panda and being the one who changed the family dynamics. And at the end, you see how everybody around her started to change, right? The mom started to feed her red panda, and also we see that the dad chime in more in the family business. He used to be more in the background, right? So I also experienced it myself personally, that after I started therapy and changing some of the dynamics after I have my own daughter, I see that just by changing myself, I've started to change some of the behaviors of those folks around me, including my mother, including my partner. So I know that a lot of you in this room, you are in a position of serving people, counseling for other people, helping other people, but also don't forget that we also need to heal ourselves, that sometimes all people need to see is our change, and then they will pick up the pace. That's all we have, so we can move to the Q&A. Thank you, Kelsey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther and Noel. And just before we transition to the Q&A, I'd love to do a bit of a spotlight on our illustration so folks can kind of see what was created through our conversation today so far. And then we'll be transitioning to another board that will be specifically for our Q&A in the remaining time. So while we do that, and have that highlighted for you all, please remember to share your questions for our panelists in the Q&A. So that's different than the chat. You're going to want to go to the Q&A button, select that, and then type your questions in there. Okay, looks like we might have to do a stop share on the slide. Great, wonderful. Let's see here. So folks, if you want to kind of do a better zoom in of the illustration, you can hit the three dots at the top of the illustration video panel and click pin, and it will large screen it for you. And you can see some of the wonderful content around diaspora, around some of the violence against women within the API community that was highlighted during the presentation, aspects of colonization and intergenerational trauma, stolen generations, but also how we can build resiliency through our family systems and through our culture and our language. So thank you so much to our illustrator for highlighting that for us. So now we're going to transition, as we mentioned, into the Q&A. We'll be sharing with you another illustration as we close out today. But one of the first questions that we had that came in was from an attendee who was really interested in attending today's session because they work in a variety of mental and behavioral health systems, particularly in relation to drug and alcohol. And although they've worked as a social worker in that space for decades, they haven't had very many API clients. And so they're wondering if you as presenters might be able to speak to maybe interconnections and intersections with the API community and drug and alcohol, as well as how that might connect to intergenerational trauma from what you've presented to today. And being a Disney film, I'm not sure if Turning Red actually had anything about alcohol in it.
I can
there
jump.
Might be. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Esther.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. Actually, the drug and alcohol problem is a huge problem, at least in the Chinese immigrant communities, the communities that we serve, is also extremely stigmatized because of this pressure to not air dirty laundry to the community. So, but it's a huge problem. Addiction in general is a huge problem, and also domestic violence. Those are the most stigmatized, not talked about, but very common in the communities that we serve. If you don't hear it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It probably means that people are not comfortable going forward or sharing these family secrecy, the red panda, with people that they perceive as outsiders. There's also a general distrust with people who work for the system. So people might feel more comfortable talking to their aunties, or a friend, than to talk to a professional about this kind of stuff. And in the community programs that we do, we tend to not say those words directly, because for example, I create programs around mental health. Sometimes we have to talk about mental illness, but we really try to, when we're doing translation, we really try to avoid those really stigmatized words, and instead really focusing on the strength. So we noticed that, for example, we focus on a strength that can overcome addiction instead of talking about addiction, but also recognize that addiction is very common. The other thing that is very useful is also being vulnerable ourselves, and showing the red panda, or not, or showing that at least we're not perfect, sometimes work very well with the communities that I serve. In general, statistics around health issues, mental health issues, and challenges among AAPI is very underreported, and also we don't really have any disaggregate data to show what kind of particular challenge each Asian ethnic group is facing. So this is a general problem with research and also awareness at the entire societal level. At the community level, much has to be done to destigmatize and providing services that is culturally relevant, and creating safe space where people can talk about these kind of issues. We're very far away, and there's much to be done. So I'm not surprised that that you have not encountered any API clients.
And I could share, being a social worker in Philly for the past 15 years, the Philadelphia mental health system, they're just not equipped for Asian American clients. We're talking about things like even folks who are not documented, like access to insurance, language capacity is just not there. We don't do a good job in mental health and promoting sort of pathways to mental health amongst the community and community. I'll share this. One of my jobs a while ago, was I was a program director for medicated assisted treatment. When we actually went to the community and created a MAT program, we saw, and I've worked in methadone clinics before. I've worked with folks struggling with opiate addiction. I rarely saw AAPI folks, and I knew why, because there wasn't language for it, nor was there sort of folks who they can probably even connect to, and the way in which mental health is trained is very Western. It doesn't really account for collectivist frameworks and structures. And when we opened the MAT clinic in a primary care setting, it wasn't a mental health facility, there was a huge group of folks who knew each other, who had struggled with opiate addiction, never having treatment for 10 years. And so I think the city right now, the systems in place are not equipped for AAPI communities, and hopefully that can change, and with more capacity building with that.
Yeah, can I also add real quick that this is also an ongoing conversation that I have with Noel personally about the spectrum of care, how we need to expand, how mental health services need to be delivered. So at the highest level, we have the psychiatrists, in hospitals, right? At the mid-level, we have therapists. But then also at the bottom level, we need to expand the way we think about who counts as a mental health workers, right? Can we expand access to peer specialists, but also like community health workers, right? Can we bring mental health services to doctors' offices to understand mental health as health in general? Can we give more resources to nonprofits and community-based organizations to expand their services that would promote wellness on the ground? So we really need a more holistic way to understand what counts as mental health care.
Wonderful. And we're definitely going to come back to resources as a question that we probably conclude with before handing it back over to our wonderful partnership team. But I think given our time, I'm probably going to combine a few questions that I'm seeing here. And also reflecting on what you had shared with me before this presentation. One of the questions, and a few coming in, center around, did you see this movie coming, like the Turning Red? And there's been this influx of new films in the past few years that really highlight the diversity of the diaspora of Asian voices, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. And so we're wondering what your thoughts are on pop culture representations of AAPI connected to mental health and behavioral health, and then what you might hope for in the future. And that's a very broad question, so you can feel free to answer it however you would like. But do we need more Turning Reds? Were there some Asian communities not represented in the film, or in the films that have come out recently that you think need their voices to be amplified?
I love the direction that Disney and Pixar are going. I mean, Moana, I think, well, even like Turning Red, I was like, I'm not Turning Red, the ice, what is it? Frozen. Even Frozen, I was like, wow, like there wasn't like a love story. Like, this is fantastic. Like, folks and women can also just be like heroines and like heroes. It doesn't have to be tied to like this compulsive heterosexuality, right? And so I really liked Frozen. Moana, I think, really talked about indigenous wisdom and the importance of ancestry. So I really like the even the last what was the Last Dragon? I forget the name, and I loved it. What was it? The
Raya?
Yeah,
Raya?
Yeah, Raya the Last Dragon, I thought was like another sort of element to it. I'm just really glad to see that there are more Asian American writers who are out there creating more story.
Yeah, and the latest I think I really like is Everything Everywhere All at Once, also dealing with intergenerational trauma. And we do need more voices. I think that most of the Asian voices has been centered on East Asian so far. So I would like to see it expand to include more Southeast Asian voices, South Asian voices. I think Marvel just came up with a new superhero who's an Asian girl. I haven't really seen that one, but then I think there are a lot of great writers out there who are doing more and more to increase representation. So I think we're going in the right direction, but more needs to be done.
Wonderful. And I think what I heard there from both of you is also films by those from that community representing their community. So sometimes there's the added nothing about us without us. And I think we're starting to see more of that, and it just needs to continue, as you mentioned. So I think to close out, I'll just combine the last two questions and give you an opportunity just to share your closing thoughts as we transition back over to Nancy and Jamal. And so with that, are there, any sort of last remaining thoughts about how non-AAPI individuals could support AAPI, or resources that you would recommend for those who've tuned in today to continue learning after today's session?
I'm gonna jump in. So for non-AAPI folks, I think it would be good to start with supporting AAPI production. Movies and any cultural products that has a authentic and good representation of AAPI. I think there is a phrase that I often shared with my Asian friends, that love our people, not just our food, right? So Asian, when people think about Asian, people think about our food, but not so much about our people. So there's a lot of thoughts about what counts as cultural appropriation, what counts as cultural appropriation. I think really learning the context in which the food is made and how it's served and how it's being shared among people would be a start. And just like what Nancy shared in the beginning, we're not a monolith. AAPI cultures are vast, and we speak different languages, we practice different religions, we eat different foods. It's so vast and diverse. But at the same time, I think the pandemic and the recent anti-Asian hate has forced us to really unite, because whether we know that we're different or not, other people see us through the way we carry our body and our appearance. So in that way, that we experience anti-Asian racism very similarly. So that's something that we share, and that we really need to unite to tackle with that.
And I would say, this is a really interesting conversation. I was in this group of social workers, and we were talking about anti-Black racism and often how AAPI identities are not even included. And my question to them was, did you ever think about the dreams of the person in the kitchen of a Chinese restaurant, and where that person's story begins and ends? What citizenship and privilege, I think, acknowledging the privilege of citizenship in the US. And when I mean citizenship, I mean having a blue passport, having access to insurance, all of these elements, and how that's completely now negated in these conversations that sometimes sound like the oppression Olympics here. But those are really important, I think, components to incorporating in our frameworks around understanding identity. And so I think of AAPI folks are everywhere in Philly, everywhere and anywhere, thinking about the stories of the nail tech, you know what I mean? Or the stories of the AAPI doctor that's being spit on, you know what I mean? Or the nurses, there's stories everywhere. And so I guess my question becomes, for non-AAPI folks, how often do you think about citizenship? There's people in my family that are undocumented, you know what I mean? And I think about this idea of, oh, well, that's and I think maybe I'm speaking for Esther, but this conversation around citizenship is very prevalent in our work. And when you say citizenship, not just a sense of belonging, but legal citizenship. And even if you were born here or have your papers, that's still there's still an anxiety, a stress, and a privilege dynamic there. So for those who are not AAPI folks, if you're not incorporating citizenship and diaspora to your understanding of race and identity, I would encourage you to consider it, because it is a huge framework to deepen your analysis and relating.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Castillo and Dr. Ramirez for such a wonderful presentation, and to all of you for participating. You really gave us a wonderful Q&A and conversation. Just as we are tuning out, I will encourage you to just take a look again at our illustration. You can see a little bit more of what was designed for today. If you just hover above Asian American Womanhood and Resilience and click pin, it will full screen for you. You can see a little bit of what was created. The final illustrations will be posted on our website and available to you to access after today's session, along with other materials. So for our closeout and some logistics, over to Nancy and Jamal to close us out. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Kelsey. We'd like to thank Esther and Noel for an amazing presentation. I feel like I learned so much, and there's so much there that I want to go back and re-listen to, because I think it's so beneficial. Would be so beneficial to be able to hear again, and to start to incorporate some of those things and think about some of those things that were being talked about. So our next webinar is gender identity. When do children know, and much more, the nuances of LGBTQ plus and mental health, with our speaker, Melissa Perkins. And that will be on Thursday, August 11th, 2022 from 2 to 4 p.m. And please note that that is an extended webinar time of 2 hours. So we will be starting at 2 o'clock that day and not 2:30. We look forward to having you join us. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
I would just like to add one thing to everyone. I will be putting together some resources of all that we were shared with us today and sharing that with everyone who is in attendance, as well as the recording of this event. And as Jamal had mentioned earlier, and I would like to say with great gratitude and appreciation, my thanks to Esther and Noel, my friends, my allies, and amazing human beings. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone. We'll stay around for a little bit, just to make sure that everyone has no more questions about technical things. But thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next time.